The whine rose thin from the road, a tired sound that made the dust seem heavier. A dog stood there, narrow as a shadow, legs set too straight to be steady. He tried a step, slid, and let out another thread of noise that frayed at the end. Dusk pooled along the canal bank, reeds leaning toward dark water that smelled of silt and old rain. A passerby slowed without thinking, palms open, shoulders turned, so he would not look like a wall. Up close, every rib on the dog showed under a dull coat. His tail hung low, not tucked, as if the little strength left belonged to breath alone. When the man crouched, the dog glanced past him toward the bank, then back to the empty hands waiting in the dust. The man unfolded a clean cloth and set it down. The dog stepped, trembled, and folded into it like dry grass. There was no fight. His body pressed to the man's knees, then into his arms, a soft surrender that felt less like trust and more like the end of trying to stand. Up close, the dog's breath was warm and dry. His heart fluttered fast against the man's forearm. "It's okay, boy," the man said, the words quiet enough to be part of the air. He stood slowly, surprised by the lightness, the kind of weight that means days of not enough. The road stayed empty. Midges hung above the ditch. The dog's head turned again toward the canal, not frantic, just fixed, as if a thread he could not see tugged his gaze through the reeds. The man crossed to the edge of the road, away from the track of trucks, and set the dog on the cloth. The dog tried to rise, thought better of it, and let his chest rest. He swallowed around a dry throat. The man unscrewed a small bottle, wet a corner of the cloth, and touched it to the dog's lip. The tongue flicked once, careful, then again a little longer. Under the fur, burrs and foxtails clung to skin. A thin scab crossed the hind leg where wire might have cut. The pads were pale and worn. A fly landed near the eye, and the ear twitched without much conviction. When the man slid a hand beneath the dog's chest, the body accepted the lift, breath changing but steady. The head turned once more toward the canal, the way a needle swings to a known direction. The canal's voice was small, a run of water tapping roots. The last of the light stretched along it like a thin band of metal. The man carried the dog a few steps to the fringe of grass, where the ground felt cool. A line of ants worked up a stem. The dog stretched his neck and sniffed, nose trembling, body still. It was not hope in human terms. It was recognition, water and mud, and something in the reeds that matched a memory of scent. "Easy," the man murmured, the sound barely more than breath. He knelt and let the dog rest two paws on the bank. The paws shook, but held. The dog drew air as if tasting a room he had left. Somewhere under roots, a frog made a single note like a finger on a drum. He lifted the dog and followed the bank, keeping the canal to their left so the nose could read what eyes could not. Dust rose and settled without urgency. The dog's head lifted and lowered in small arcs, the nostrils opening like tiny doors. Each time his gaze returned to the same slit in the reeds, the man paused and waited. They moved 20 steps, maybe 30, then stopped to let the dog breathe and decide. Nothing in the man's body hurried. The weight in his arms felt less like a burden than a promise to move gently. The dog blinked slowly. Dust clung to his lashes like pale grit. When the man set him down again, the dog braced through the front legs. The back legs quivered and almost answered. He leaned into the man's shin without looking, using it like a low post. He took 2 shallow breaths, then a third that went deeper, the rib cage widening and staying there a heartbeat longer. The tongue touched the cloth and the swallow came easier. He watched the waterline without blinking, the way a bird fixes on a point just before it lifts. The reeds smelled green and bruised. The man noticed small signs he had not marked in other evenings. A gate left half latched on a yard, a metal bowl near a stoop, feathers caught in thistle near the ditch. They were not proof of anything, only pieces the dog's attention sharpened into a path. The bank dipped where old floods had eaten at it, leaving shallow caves spanned by roots that gripped like fingers. The dog lifted his head when they passed, the first one, then let it fall. At the second, the nose flared, and a thin sound rose in his throat, not a whine, not a cry, but something that made the man stop. He knelt again and let the paws rest on the edge. The dog inhaled with a slow pull that seemed to steady his whole body. He did not try to crawl. He listened to the water licking soil, to insects ticking in the grass, to the tiny drip that measured time from a leaf. The gaze slid to a darker panel of reed where two stems crossed. He held it there long enough that the man could feel the choice settling, as visible as the tilt of a stem in wind. They did not push deeper. Night had begun to press gently along the bank. The man lifted the dog once more and turned back toward the broader path. Not away from the place, but alongside it, matching pace with something unseen. He kept the reeds within reach of the nose. The dog rested, then looked left again, checking that same window in the growth, as if it were a door he meant to approach when he could stand. Crickets found their long chorus. The sky traded its last clear blue for a grey that held the first star. The man set the dog on the cloth a final time for the evening, and let the bottle drop a few more small sips along the tongue. The dog swallowed and closed his eyes for a count, then opened them to fix once more on the reeds. The road, the water, the man, the dog, 4 quiet facts under the edge of night. Dust lay flat. A slow wind accepted the day's heat and carried it away in thin strands. The dog let his head fall, not in defeat, but in that tired way animals rest between decisions. The man laid a palm along the ribs and felt the breath even and deepen by increments. They stood together as the light finished. The canal kept speaking softly, a ribboned sound just louder than the insects. The dog's eyes held the bank until darkness hid the small window of reed he kept choosing. When at last the man lifted him to go, the dog turned his head once more toward the water, steady as a needle, and then let the night carry them a few quiet steps along the path. He drank in slow, careful sips, each one held at the tongue before it slid down. Drops gathered along his whiskers and fell to the cloth. When the bottle tipped away, he didn't beg for more. He pressed his head into the crook of the man's elbow and went still. The tremor in his ribs softened to a thin hum the man could feel through his sleeve. Night cooled the canal bank. Reeds gave off a bruised green smell. Iron lay faint on the air. The water made its low talk beneath roots. The man rose with care, shifting the dog's weight so bones would not knock against bones. Then the dog turned his face from the man's sleeve toward a tangle where weeds had matted into a wall, and he leaned, not with strength, but with intention, a pull small as a compass needle. "Okay," the man said, voice level with the dark. He stepped where the ground held and let the dog choose the next inch. The slope puckered under bindweed, old wire braided through stems. Somewhere beneath the growth, a culvert ran under the lane. The dog's breath changed when the scent of stone and leaf rot reached him. He shifted the press of his head to the man's arm and nosed the air in short, measuring draws. When his paws touched earth, he didn't lurch. He arranged himself the way animals do when a mistake will cost more than patience. The front feet searched for something firm. One hind paw lifted and hovered as if the leg remembered an injury. His tail hung low, conserving what he could. He took one step and stopped, then another, and let out a sound so thin it barely existed, an urgent line without volume. The man read the line by feel and followed. Grass combed the dog's shins, twigs ticked, mud showed a dull shine ahead. The dog lowered his chest and reached with his nose into a crosshatch of stems, breathing as if the air itself held a map. He set the lifted paw down and used it for the distance of a breath. They moved until a hush signaled the entrance. Wind failed there, temperature dropped, scents layered, water, iron, mouse, something faint and sour like milk in a warm room. Weeds had woven a roof from trash and time, blue twine, sackcloth thread, a cracked lid pressed flat by seasons. Under that crust the ground depressed and vanished under the road. Damp silt held lines where something had passed and then been taken by dark. The man crouched because the dog did. He did not widen the gap. Soil at the rim felt friable, ready to slump. He looked where the dog looked. The tunnel returned cool breath and the smell of old flood. The dog made the sound again, softer, as if throwing a thread forward and testing what drew back along it. Silence gathered. The dog's nose traced a seam right of the mouth where powdery earth had sifted down and made a fringe under stems. He stood and failed and stood again, taking ground by inches. The man let an arm bear some of the chest's weight, enough to keep the slide from stealing his progress. Air from the culvert cooled the man's wrist. It held that faint sourness under layered smells, familiar to anything that has lived near milk. He did not name it. He waited to see if the dog would. The dog widened his nostrils, shut his mouth, drew 3 long breaths and settled as if a picture had come together without the need to move yet. They checked the lower bend where the culvert emptied to a gully and found briars and old runoff. The dog nosed the mess and withdrew. That was not the way. He turned himself by degrees and returned to the first opening, setting his paws where he had placed them before. He half-crawled until his chest met shadow and stopped. He listened. The listening became a work the whole body performed. Even his tail joined it, still but alive. The tunnel breathed in a rhythm not theirs, air drawing out, thinning, drifting back. The dog tipped his head a fraction, recognition with a boundary. The man lifted a strand of wire, eased a clod that would slide, and pressed damp soil flat with his palm. He did not cut a path. He rehearsed how the weeds wanted to lie so he could return them without tears. The dog kept the entrance in his gaze the way a sentinel keeps a door, not entering, not abandoning. "Easy, Beta," the man said, and set the bottle cap with a spoon of water near the paw. The dog licked once, then returned to the seam of scent. He made that small sound again and went quiet, the way a call changes when the caller cares more about being answered than being heard. Minutes stacked. Dew lifted the smell of crushed stalk. The man measured the soil's give with fingertips, the culvert's breath with the hair on his arm, the dog's fatigue by the way the lifted paw hovered lower each time before it rose again. Nothing in him wanted to rush a place that had kept its shape this long without his help. When the dog's sway grew visible, the man folded the cloth and slid an arm under the narrow chest. The body accepted support without slackening attention. Even as he lifted, the dog angled his head toward the black throat. Only when weight balanced against bone did the gaze release. They stepped back the way they had come, reversing the trail by memory, the cracked lid, the blue twine, the seam where sifted dust feathered the weed line. Reeds leaned and returned to their places. The canal stitched its quiet run. The culvert stayed as it had been, mouth guarded by weft and shadow. On the firmer path the dog resettled his face in the crook of the elbow, as if that hollowness were a den for now. His shoulder loosened against the man's ribs. The tremor did not vanish, but its tone changed, less panic than spent muscle. He drifted without sleep, the way a creature rests when it trusts movement more than stillness. They didn't go far. The man sat on a cool patch near the bank and reviewed what the tunnel had given: angle, weakness in the rim, weave that would part without collapse, rhythm of air. He planned for daylight in the slow way night teaches, preparing to do a thing right on the first asking. The dog's ear twitched at a moth's soft battering and the mud's fine sigh. He did not whine now. He had delivered the message his body knew how to carry. The rest would be done by hands and day. He closed his eyes and opened them once more to look toward the weeds. They rose when his weight began to lean with sleep. The man gathered the cloth and stood, finding again the balance that spared sore places from pressure. They left the culvert as they had found it. Roof of dead stems, rim brushed clean of loose crumble, entrance no wider than a hand. Ahead the path widened, toward the lane where dust lay like ash. The dog lifted his head once and set it down again. His work for the night had been to show. The man's would come next, and he would give it the same quiet. The reeds leaned back from the culvert mouth as daylight returned, showing the same narrow seam of soil where the dog had stopped the night before. His head lifted when the man knelt, and he gave a low sound that was not panic, but insistence, a reminder of the place where the earth itself seemed to breathe. The man's hands went carefully to work, brushing away clumps of loose dirt, easing stems aside, and firming the edges so nothing above would collapse too quickly. The dog waited just behind, standing with weight on his forelegs, one hind paw drawn close to his belly as if too sore to rest on ground. He nosed forward whenever the man shifted a stone, his body vibrating with faint tension. He did not push past, but he stayed close enough that the warmth of his breath reached the man's wrist. The breach widened slowly. At first only cool air seeped out, carrying the smell of damp earth and roots. Then, as more space opened, a fainter scent came, sweet, stale, and heavy. The dog froze when it reached him, his ears tipped forward, his ribs lifted on a long inhale. He whined, soft and low, the kind of sound that rises from deep memory rather than from sudden pain. The man paused. He pressed down a sagging ridge of soil, then slid the last of the weeds aside. The hollow appeared, a pocket of darkness beneath a small cave-in, and within it lay the form of another dog. She had wedged herself beneath the fall, her body curved to keep a channel open. Her muzzle rested in soil, her chest no longer moving. Around her flank, pressed tight against her still fur, were 5 tiny bodies. 2 lay still, already cooled by the damp air, but 3 others shifted faintly, muzzles searching, ribs fluttering with the shallow rhythm of life. Their small sounds were thin, almost drowned in the whisper of running water beyond the culvert. One lifted its head just enough to nudge blindly into its mother's fur before collapsing again into her shape. The father, because there was no mistaking it now, lunged forward, not with force but with certainty, pouring against the soil until the man steadied him. His nose went first to the pups, then back to the mother's unmoving chest. He whined again, longer this time, and pressed his muzzle to the side of her neck. The man lowered his eyes. He knew what had been done here. The mother had held her body in that space, taking the weight of the fall so the pups could breathe a little longer. She had traded her air for theirs, her stillness for their chance. The soil around her showed where she had pressed herself against it, ribs making a wall to guard the hollow. The man reached in and freed the living pups one by one. Each was scarcely larger than a fist, fur damp with soil, their eyes sealed shut. Their bodies trembling from effort they had no strength to give. He cupped them in his palms, setting them on the folded cloth at his knees. They gave out tiny squeaks that rose and fell like sparrow notes, sounds too small to fill the space left behind. The father circled, chest brushing the soil, tail low and still. He nudged each pup as it was laid down, then turned back to the mother, unwilling to leave her place. He pressed his nose into the hollow again, inhaling as if scent might restore what sight and touch had already told. The man touched her side once, a silent acknowledgement, before folding the earth gently back across her form, leaving the hollow undisturbed but no longer exposed. The soil fell softly, pattering like rain on her back. The pups stirred at the sound, rooting blindly toward the warmth of each other. The truth of the scene settled heavy in the dusk air. This gaunt, trembling dog had not been crying for himself. Every turn of his head, every whine, every pull toward the culvert had been for what lay beneath, the family he could not save alone. His cries had been signals, not pleas. His weakness had carried a message stronger than his body could. The man gathered the cloth, folding its edges around the three still living pups. They huddled close, tiny bodies pushing against each other, searching for milk that was no longer there. He lifted them carefully, then let the father press his nose through the folds, reassuring them with the scent they still knew. The father's chest heaved once, and he looked back at the reeds, the place where the earth had swallowed the rest. They turned toward the path, the man holding the fragile bundle, the father walking at his knee, every step weighted with both loss and duty. Behind them, the culvert whispered with water and darkness, keeping the shape of the mother who had made space where none existed, so her young could draw breath. And in that quiet, as the night deepened, the story of the cry at dusk reshaped itself. It was not the cry of one animal failing, but the signal of a father leading someone, anyone, back to the hollow, where love had outlasted life itself. The shed kept a steady warmth the evening could not touch. The man slid the door aside and stepped in with the cloth bundle balanced against his chest. The dog followed so close his shoulder brushed the man's leg, head low, eyes fixed on the faint movements inside the folds. He spread a wool blanket on a wooden crate, laid flat, and unfolded the bundle. 3 pups lay there, damp with soil and effort, hardly heavier than a handful of seed. Blind muzzles searched in slow arcs until they met each other, then went still, taking comfort from the line of warmth where their bodies touched. The father crept forward, placing each paw carefully. He lowered his chin to the edge of the blanket so whiskers touched the nearest ribs. When the tiny chest rose, he held still. When it fell, he let out a faint breath, as if matching it. On a single-burner stove, the man warmed milk, not to boil. He tested a drop on his wrist, drew it into a needleless syringe, and set a shallow bowl of water at the father's paws. Beside it, a piece of bread softened in broth until it lost its hard edges. "Easy, Beta," he murmured. The first pup took a droplet along the lip and paused. A second droplet found the corner of the mouth. A swallow followed, small but sure. He fed in slow intervals, one mouthful, a breath another, and watched the ribs so air would be chosen before hunger every time. The father breathed close enough to fog the cup's rim. He did not steal a taste. He seemed to measure the same things the man measured: the sweep of the ribs, the return of color to the tongue, the brief strength in the jaw. Between feedings, the man rubbed a warm cotton pad along each small belly and under the tail, coaxing the body to do what cold earth had paused. Drops of urine showed clean and pale. The father's nose followed the motions, learning by scent what needed doing next. When one pup found a thin sound, he answered with a slow lick to the crown and let silence settle again. He lifted the second pup and repeated the same patience. Droplet, wait, droplet, wait. The tiny jaw worked with more certainty. The man's hands learned the angle and pressure, reading the moment when swallow reflex engaged and when it faltered. He set the pup down, and the father let his chest expand and fall, as a watchman loosens after a gate is barred. Softened bread went to the dog in small pieces. He chewed carefully, drank, and returned his chin to the blanket. He took nothing from the pups, not milk, not space. The shed filled with ordinary sound, the kettle's light click as metal cooled, a faint wheeze when a pup cleared its throat, the soft rasp of blanket under small paws. Outside, cricket stitched a steady line through the dark. He built a safe warmth, a hot water bottle wrapped twice under the far edge of the blanket, so heat would be a choice, not a demand. A cotton towel went above it. He checked with the back of his hand. It was right. He offered milk again to the smallest pup, then rested it against the father's foreleg so swallowing could finish without hurry. The mouth opened and closed in sleep, the echo of feeding moving along the jaw. The father did not shift except to lower his head until whiskers brushed the tiny flank. A quiet tone sounded in his chest at each breath, more hum than whine, present and steady. When the round ended, the man arranged the three along the warm side, not touching the bottle but close enough to borrow its heat. He tugged the blanket to make a low ridge they could press against. The father eased himself down with the care of an animal that knows which joints will protest. He curled, so his body reached the length of the crate without leaning on it, chin set where sound would travel fastest from small ribs to him. He cleaned the father's hind leg with saline and cotton, rolling away a thin scab without tearing new skin. The dog accepted the handling without pull or flinch, watching the pups the whole time. A burr came free from Topher and dropped into a dish. The paw flexed once and relaxed. "Bass," the man said softly. "Enough for now." He lowered the flame until the blue ring was a quiet circle. He smoothed the blanket and stepped back half a pace, choosing to leave more room to watching than to motion. The father's eyes closed part way and opened when one pup twitched. The moment lengthened, not tense, simply attentive. Breathing settled into a shared tide, 3 small, 1 larger, 3 small, 1 larger, an ear tipped at a tiny hiccup of air. The man's hand rose and stilled, ready but not rushing. The pups slept, woke, and slept again in the rolling pattern of new life that ignores clocks. He noted the time between feeds, the volume each had taken, the strength of each swallow. Morning would come plain, more milk, a cupped measure of weight, a call to the clinic for advice, not removal unless need demanded. The shed would do for now with its dry floor and even air. Trust had a place here, man by the door, dog at the crate, warmth held where breath could be counted. When stiffness crept into muscle, he refreshed the bottle, sliding new heat under the blanket without lifting the pups. One yawned wide without sound and settled with a small roll of shoulder. The father's whiskers moved with his breath. His tail lay quiet, a line ending near the man's boot. As they sat like that while night reset itself around them, care had found a shape: feed, warmth, rest, repeat. Nothing dramatic would be asked, only patience and soft hands. In that patience, The father listened with his whole body, and the man stepped back far enough for that listening to do its work. The shed held the quiet as if built for it. The pup's ribs rose and fell under the blanket, small and sure. The father kept his chin near those movements and watched, steady as breath. Dawn spread pale across the fields, the kind of light that flattens shadows and makes every detail sharp. The man carried a spade in one hand and a folded length of cloth in the other. The dog followed, steady but slow, the limp in his hind leg more visible now that the urgency had passed. They walked to the hedgerow that lined the far edge of the yard, where grass grew tall and a row of stones had been left by years of ploughing. The mother lay still within the cloth, her body light in a way that felt heavier than weight. He laid her down in the grass, then cut into the soil, turning it carefully, each thrust of the spade quiet, deliberate. The dog stayed close, watching with ears half back, as if listening to sounds only he could hear. When the earth had opened wide enough, the man lifted her in and spread the cloth over her one final time. He lowered the soil back with steady hands, smoothing it flat, tamping it gently so no hollow remained. When it was done, he gathered 5 small stones from the hedgerow and set them in a row along the mound. Not large, not carved, only enough to say the place was known and marked. The dog stepped forward and lowered his head until his nose touched the soil. He did not whine. He simply breathed there, long and still, then turned away to the shed where the pups waited. Inside, warmth still held. The 3 small bodies had curled tighter against each other during the night, ribs rising in shallow rhythm. They stirred when the man entered, faint squeaks spilling into the air, too weak to fill it, but strong enough to ask for more of life. He set out fresh milk, measured by drops again, patient, practical. The dog stood by, eyes steady, tail low. He accepted water and a few softened crumbs, but his attention never left the crate. Arrangements had been made. A woman from the village, accustomed to fostering litters abandoned or orphaned, would take the pups when they were strong enough for travel. The man had spoken to her before dawn, her voice calm on the phone, promising warm boxes, clean hands, the patience required. Until then, the shed would serve, and he would return as often as needed. When the feeding ended, he wiped each small mouth, checked each belly, and laid them back against the warm side of the blanket. The dog eased himself down beside them, curling into the same shape as the night before, chin near their ribs, ears pricked to every sound. His eyes were tired, but they held light enough to keep watch. The man stood at the door and looked once more toward the canal bank. The reeds moved faintly in the new breeze, nothing more. The culvert kept its silence. Still, when the dog lifted his head, he turned it that way, a last check, as though answering a call no longer heard by others. He held it for a breath, then let it fall, choosing instead the small sounds behind him. The man knelt once, brushing the fur along the dog's neck. Dust from the night before still clung there, a faint reminder of how close the earth had been. He felt the weight of a muzzle against his sleeve, not pressing, just resting. When he pulled back, paw prints marked the fabric in a scatter of soil. The pups shifted again, rooting blindly toward each other, and the dog lowered his nose until they settled. Their breaths fell into a rhythm that seemed to steady his own. The man stepped back, leaving space for that quiet bond to hold. He pulled the door halfway closed, enough for light to enter, but not enough for drafts to creep through. Outside, the sun rose clean and pale. Dew glittered along the hedgerow, catching on the stones that marked the mother's place. A crow passed overhead, wings slow against the brightening sky. The man paused, letting the air settle around him, carrying with it the scents of earth, milk, and the faint sweetness of new grass. When he finally walked away, the shed held its silence, broken only by the smallest of sounds. 3 pups breathing, 1 father keeping watch. On his shirt, the soil-dark paw print stayed, a quiet mark that would wash away in time, but not from memory. He carried them into morning, the weight of gratitude pressed deeper than words, light as breath, permanent as stone.